My daughter mocked me in front of everyone. And the worst part was that my wife laughed too. My name is Michael. I'm 52 years old, and today I am the man my family believes they destroyed. But what they don't know is that they only gave me the freedom I never dared to take. Imagine spending 25 years building a refuge, a legacy, and a reputation, only for the blood of your blood to use you as the punchline of an elegant dinner in front of strangers. My own daughter looked me in the eyes and, with a carefully rehearsed smile, stripped me of my dignity just to earn points with her new in-laws. The worst part wasn't her venom, but the laughter of my wife. That dry sound that confirmed I was no longer a man to them, but an ATM with an expiration date. In that moment, while the red wine shimmered in their glasses and silence tightened around my throat, I understood that loyalty has a price they could no longer afford to pay. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the table. I didn't even ask for an explanation. I simply watched as they celebrated my humiliation, storing every word in the coldest corner of my memory. They thought I was the weak man at the table, the tired old father who would accept any crumb of affection in exchange for silence. What an expensive mistake they made. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave your like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. To understand how we ended up at that dinner, you have to understand who I was before they decided I was the target of their jokes. For 2 decades, my life was a straight line of sacrifice. I'm not a man of grand gestures or empty words. I'm a man of results. I built my industrial supply company from the ground up, working 16 hours a day, eating in the seat of an old pickup truck while my hands filled with grease and my knees began to feel the weight of the years. All that effort had a name: Victoria, my daughter, and a face: Elizabeth, my wife. I believed in my ignorance as a protective man that providing was the same as loving. I thought that if they had the best house in the neighborhood, if the cars were replaced every 2 years, and if trips to Europe were an annual routine, my place in their hearts was guaranteed. What a basic mistake. Victoria grew up surrounded by privileges I never had. I watched her become a woman educated in the best schools, always protected by a glass bubble that I myself had blown around her. She never lacked anything, and maybe that was my first sin. I gave her a world where money appeared like magic in her bank account, without her ever seeing the sweat it took to earn it. Elizabeth, for her part, grew accustomed to the life of the local high society. She became an expert in charity events, in choosing the exact shade of curtains, and in organizing dinners that looked like they came straight out of a magazine. I was the silent engine behind that machine. I arrived home late, exhausted, with the smell of metal and work still clinging to my skin, and they welcomed me with a distracted smile before returning to their screens or their plans. I felt proud, I truly did. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a successful man because my family never knew scarcity. What I didn't realize was that to them, I was slowly becoming just another piece of furniture in the house. An expensive piece, useful but soulless in their eyes. A year ago, Victoria met her fiancé, Daniel, a guy from a proper family, the kind that inherits last names and looks down on anyone who has calluses on their hands. From the first day, I felt his condescension. He looked at me as if I were an intruder in my own living room. Elizabeth, instead of defending me, began to blend in with them. She started correcting my manners, telling me not to talk about my work during dinners because it wasn't elegant, asking me to buy more expensive suits so I wouldn't clash with Daniel's parents. And I gave in. I gave in because I wanted my daughter to be happy, because I believed marriage was an alliance, and that my role was to make their path easier. I made myself invisible by choice, believing respect still existed beneath the surface. The atmosphere at home changed drastically in the months before the wedding. The gatherings became rituals of exclusion. They talked about overseas investments, golf clubs I didn't belong to, and people I had never met. I sat there listening, sometimes trying to contribute something from my real experience in the market, only to receive a reproachful look from Elizabeth, or an impatient sigh from Victoria. "Dad, you don't understand how these things work now," she would say with a smugness that cut deep into my bones. I stayed silent. My emotional status had become that of a cold observer. I began to notice that my presence made them uncomfortable. I was the reminder that their current status didn't come from noble lineage, but from the hard work of a man who still knew what it meant to get his hands dirty. On the day of that dinner, the atmosphere was charged with an expectation I failed to read. It was the official presentation to Daniel's extended family. I had paid for everything: the luxury catering, the reserve wines, even the additional service staff. I wore the suit Elizabeth had chosen, sat where they told me to sit, and prepared myself to be the silent host. I felt like a guest in my own home. I watched Elizabeth, radiant in her designer dress, laughing with Daniel's mother, and for a moment I felt that all the effort had been worth it. But then the conversation turned to the origins of my company. One of Daniel's uncles, a man with an air of superiority, asked me with a mocking smile if it was true that I had started out hauling cargo on a dock. The silence that followed was the prelude to the storm. I looked at Victoria, hoping she, my little girl, would end the mockery with the pride of knowing where her comfort came from. What I received instead was an icy dagger that changed the course of my life forever. The silence at the table was thick, the kind you could cut with the silver knife that I had paid for myself. I looked at Victoria, expecting her voice to come to my defense, expecting her to remember the nights I didn't sleep so she could have her education, her trips, and her designer clothes. But Victoria didn't defend me. She leaned forward, let out a nervous little laugh, and looked at Daniel's uncle with a complicity that turned my stomach. "Oh, Uncle, don't ask Dad that. He still has trauma from the days he used to wear those cheap flannel shirts and smell like engine grease all day. Sometimes I think he misses that beat-up pickup truck more than our family dinners. He's a man of simple tastes, you know." Laughter exploded around the table like gunshots. Daniel's parents exchanged looks of superiority, as if they had just confirmed that I was, in fact, the weak link, the new money man with no class, who only existed to sign the checks. I searched for support from Elizabeth, my wife of 25 years, the woman who had seen me come home with my hands bleeding from the freezing warehouse floors during the harshest winters. I thought she would put an end to the humiliation. But Elizabeth not only stayed calm, she let out a dry laugh, lifted her wine glass to her lips and added, "It's true. Sometimes I have to remind him he doesn't live in a workshop anymore. Michael is a very rustic man. Sometimes I wonder how we managed to civilize him even a little for tonight." A cold wave ran down my spine. It wasn't explosive anger, the kind that makes you shout or break plates. It was an icy, surgical fury. I remained still, fork in hand, watching the two women I loved most in the world mock my origins, my effort, and my essence in front of a group of strangers who despised me. Victoria kept telling distorted anecdotes, joking about my lack of a refined accent, and how I preferred eating a sandwich at a worksite instead of going to the Michelin star restaurants she loved showing off on social media. Daniel squeezed her hand, laughing along, and looked at me with a fake pity that burned inside my chest. What they didn't understand in that moment was that they were breaking something. Not my heart, that would have been too human, but the invisible contract that tied us together. In that instant, I stopped seeing them as my daughter and my wife. I saw them as parasites, feeding on their host while insulting the taste of his blood. The dinner continued and I didn't say another word. I simply watched their gestures. The way Elizabeth poured more expensive wine without even glancing at the price. The way Victoria planned a $500,000 wedding as if money simply flowed out of the walls. I was no longer there. My mind was already calculating, reviewing accounts, contracts, and properties. When dinner ended and the guests left with their condescending smiles, the silence in the house became sepulchral. Elizabeth dropped onto the sofa, slipping off her heels with a satisfied sigh. "It went perfectly, Michael. Daniel's parents were delighted. Although you should have smiled a little more. You looked like a bitter security guard." Victoria nodded while scrolling through her phone, probably uploading photos of the banquet. "Yeah, Dad, don't be so sensitive. They were just jokes to break the ice. They're worldly people. They don't understand your form and seriousness." I remained standing in the center of the living room, beneath the crystal chandelier that had cost me 3 months of work years ago. I looked at them with a calm that should have frightened them, but they were too absorbed in their own importance. "I understand perfectly," I said quietly, almost a whisper. "I understand that to you, I'm the joke at the table, the rustic man who pays the bills." Elizabeth rolled her eyes and Victoria let out an impatient scoff. "Please don't start with your working-class drama again, it's exhausting." That was the symbolic expulsion. In that moment, in my own house, I felt like a stranger, an intruder who no longer had a place in the lives of those 2 women. They had decided I was disposable, that my only function was maintaining their lifestyle while they felt ashamed of my origins. My anger transformed into iron determination. That night, while they slept dreaming about wedding flowers and borrowed luxury, I sat in my office and began moving the pieces. There would be no shouting. There would be no reconciliation. There would be justice. Tomorrow, the man with the old pickup truck would begin dismantling the world they took for granted. The next morning, I didn't wake up with resentment, but with mathematical clarity. I got up before the sun, the way I used to when I had nothing, and sat in my office. I looked at the family photos on the walls, staged smiles on yachts paid for with my overtime hours. Those photos meant nothing anymore. My plan wasn't born from impulse, but from a cold audit of my own life. They saw me as an ATM, so I decided it was time to close the bank. The first thing I did was call Robert, my lawyer and the only real friend I've had for 30 years. Robert knew the mud I came from. When I told him what had happened at the dinner, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Michael," he said in a grave voice, "if you do this, there's no going back. You'll leave them out on the street." My answer was short. They stripped me of my dignity first. I'm only giving them the reality they've always despised. The following weeks were a series of invisible moves on the board. My company, the one Victoria liked to call the Greasy Workshop, was under my personal name, but much of the property and the accounts were inside a network of trusts I had designed years earlier to protect them. The irony was almost poetic. I began the legal process to dissolve those funds, claiming asset restructuring due to operational losses that I deliberately created by moving capital into a new corporation overseas, one neither Elizabeth nor Victoria even knew existed. Meanwhile, at home, I kept my mask on. I let them continue planning their $500,000 wedding. I watched them arrive with bags from luxury stores, listened to Elizabeth talk on the phone with the event planner about floral arrangements that cost more than a laborer earns in a year. Victoria asked me for additional transfers for her bridal trousseau, and with a calm that surprised even me, I simply nodded and approved the payments from an account that was soon destined to be empty. I became the perfect actor. I poured them wine, listened to their criticisms about my shirts and my lack of culture, and inside I counted the days. My strategy was simple. The total collapse had to coincide with the moment of maximum exposure of their vanity. Through a private investigator, I discovered that Daniel's family wasn't nearly as financially solid as they pretended to be. They were counting on the dowry and the business merger they expected to make with my assets after the wedding. Daniel didn't love Victoria. He loved the liquidity of her rustic father. That realization made my heart grow even colder. My daughter was selling herself to a fortune hunter who mocked her origins, and she held his hand while doing it. I terminated the lease contracts of the house where we lived. The property belonged to one of my companies, and I simply executed an internal sale to a third party, an investment fund that I controlled. I gave the legal system the time it needed to process everything. I moved my personal savings into shielded accounts and began withdrawing my physical presence from the main businesses, leaving behind only an empty shell filled with strategically arranged legal debts. Sometimes at night, I watched them having dinner. Elizabeth talked about the envy her friends would feel when they saw the banquet. Victoria complained that the car I had given her was making a strange noise and that she wanted a better one for her honeymoon. I looked at them and felt a strange mixture of pity and disgust. They were beautiful on the outside, but inside they were rotten with a sense of superiority that I myself had fed with my silence and my wallet. "Dad, are you even listening to me?" Victoria asked one Tuesday night, annoyed because I wasn't paying attention to her jewelry catalogue. "I'm listening perfectly, daughter," I replied with a faint smile. "I'm thinking about how much things are about to change. It's going to be a surprise no one will forget." She laughed, thinking I was referring to an extravagant wedding gift. She had no idea that the gift was the naked truth. I prepared the divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. Elizabeth would receive what the prenuptial agreement we signed when we had nothing stipulated. A ridiculous amount adjusted to the inflation of 20 years ago. Enough for a small apartment in a distant neighborhood, but nothing compared to the mansion and service she believed belonged to her by divine right. Patience became my greatest ally. I waited until every credit card reached its limit, until the wedding deposits had been made and were non-refundable, and until both of their arrogance had reached its highest point. The stage was ready. The fall wouldn't be a stumble, it would be a controlled demolition. The day of the final dress fitting and the last planning dinner arrived, and with it, the end of their fantasy. We were in the main hall of our house, surrounded by fabric samples, banquet catalogues, and the arrogance of Daniel's family, who walked through my living room as if they already owned the foundation of the place. Elizabeth laughed with Daniel's mother, mocking a distant relative of mine who had asked if he could attend the wedding wearing a simple suit. "Can you imagine, Michael? Your cousin wanted to come dressed like he was going to some small-town baptism," Elizabeth said, letting out that laugh that no longer caused me pain, but a cold satisfaction. I had to tell him he should probably stay in his workshop. We don't want people thinking we're that kind of family. Victoria nodded while adjusting a tiara that cost more than the yearly salary of my best foreman. "Yeah, Dad. Please keep your people under control. I don't want them embarrassing Daniel in front of his partners." Standing beside her, Daniel shot me a sideways glance, that familiar mixture of disgust and superiority I already knew too well. It was at that precise moment that I set my wine glass down on the marble table. The sound of crystal touching stone made everyone fall silent for a second. "Don't worry," I said with a calm that seemed to cool the air in the room. "No one is going to embarrass you at the wedding, because there won't be a wedding." The silence that followed was absolute. Elizabeth frowned, assuming it was some tasteless joke. "Michael, don't be ridiculous. The wine is getting to your head." But my face didn't move. I pulled a thick envelope from my jacket and placed it on the table, right on top of Victoria's jewelry catalogue. They were legal notices. "I filed for divorce, Elizabeth, and I dissolved the trust that maintained this house and your personal accounts. Starting tomorrow at 8 in the morning, all your credit cards will be declined. This property has been sold, and the new owner takes possession in 48 hours. Victoria let out a nervous laugh, her eyes wide. "Dad, stop it. It's my wedding. You can't do this to us." I slowly stood up, feeling the weight of the years fall from my shoulders. "You said I was a man of simple tastes, Victoria, that I smelled like grease and that I was rustic. You were right. That's why I've decided to return to my roots. I've liquidated my assets and moved them into a corporation where neither of you has any voice or vote. The ATM has run out of money for parasites." Elizabeth stood up, pale and trembling with fury. "Have you lost your mind? I'm your wife. I'm entitled to half of everything." I smiled for the first time in months, a smile that never reached my eyes. "Check the prenuptial agreement we signed 25 years ago, Elizabeth. The one you called a romantic formality when we had nothing. You'll receive compensation based on our assets from back then. Enough for a small apartment far from here. There's no mansion, no chauffeur, and no status." The expression on Daniel's face was worthy of a horror film. His aristocratic mask collapsed the moment he realized the fortune he expected to rescue his family had just evaporated. "You can't do this, it's fraud," he stammered, but his voice sounded small, pathetic. I looked at him calmly. "You don't love my daughter, Daniel. You love my money. And since my money is rustic and comes from hauling cargo, I decided it isn't worthy of someone as refined as you. The wedding is cancelled because the deposits have been revoked for insufficient funds. The flowers, the venue, the catering, everything stopped today at 5 this afternoon." Victoria burst into tears. Tears of rage, not sadness. "You hate me. How can you do this to your own daughter?" I stepped closer to her, just enough for her to see there wasn't a trace of doubt in my eyes. "I don't hate you, Victoria. I'm giving you exactly what you always wanted, the opportunity to not be tied to a man as simple as me. Now you're free to build your own empire without the smell of grease from my work. But you'll do it on your own." I walked out of the room while Elizabeth screamed insults and Daniel's parents began arguing among themselves, realizing their deal had just collapsed. I didn't look back. I heard something shatter behind me, probably an expensive vase, but I didn't care. That house was no longer mine, and those women were no longer my family. They were strangers who had lived off my sacrifice while spitting in my face. My revenge wasn't an act of violence. It was simply removing the ground they believed floated beneath them by magic. When I reached the door, I felt the cool night air on my face. For the first time in decades, I breathed like a man who owed nothing to anyone. Months after that night, silence has become my most valuable possession. I learned, through brief updates from Robert, that the collapse was as spectacular as I had planned. Daniel's family broke off the engagement barely a week after the dinner. It didn't even take 7 days for them to prove that their love for Victoria had the same value as a bounced check. My daughter, who had been so ashamed of my origins, ended up living in a small rented apartment with Elizabeth, facing for the first time the reality of electricity bills, public transportation, and an office job with minimum wage. They say Elizabeth tried to contact her friends from high society, but those doors closed faster than the vault of a bank. People in that world have no memory for those who lose their shine. I don't feel joy for their misery, but I don't feel pity either. What I feel is a deep, surgical peace. I got rid of the company that had consumed me and kept only what I needed to live comfortably and discreetly. I no longer wear the suits Elizabeth used to choose so I would look civilized. I've gone back to wearing my old shirts, driving my own pickup truck, and eating wherever I please without anyone criticizing my lack of etiquette. I learned that respect cannot be bought with luxury, nor guaranteed by blood. Respect is a mutual contract, and they broke it long before I decided to collect the bill. Sometimes people ask me if I don't feel lonely after erasing my past with a single stroke. My answer is always the same. I was never more alone than when I shared a table with people who despised the effort that fed them. The loneliness I have now is my choice. The one I had before was my sentence. There was no reconciliation because there was nothing to reconcile with someone who sees you as a tool rather than as a human being. They wanted a provider, not a father or a husband. And when the provider walked away, they discovered they had nothing else to offer the world. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply withdrawing your energy, your money, and your presence from places where you are not valued, and watching life collect its debts. They thought I was the joke of the story, but in the end, reality was the one that had the last laugh. Now, every morning, I look in the mirror and recognize the man staring back at me. A rustic man, perhaps, but a free man. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories.